Before we begin, imagine spending 10 years protecting someone, taking blades for them, standing between them and death, watching them laugh, watching them suffer, watching them become a king, only to discover they're your mate, the one person you can never have. Tell me honestly, would you follow your heart, or would you walk away to protect them? Subscribe, like, and stay until the end, because this story has one of the most emotional werewolf romances I've ever told. Let's begin. The first time Lyra Vale saved Darius Stormclaw's life, she was 14, he was 15, and neither of them were important. Yet, a hunting trip had gone wrong. A rogue wolf had attacked from the shadows. Darius never saw it coming. Lyra did. She shoved him aside. The wolf's claws tore across her shoulder instead. She still carried the scar. 10 years later, Darius carried the memory. 10 years later, neither ever spoke about it. The kingdom of Stormclaw stood stronger than ever. Its borders were secure, its armies unmatched, its Alpha King respected across every territory. And beside him stood Lyra. Always. At council meetings, at royal ceremonies, during battles, during negotiations, where Darius went, Lyra followed. The kingdom trusted her. The guards respected her. The enemies feared her. Because everyone knew one thing. If you wanted to kill the Alpha King, you had to get through Lyra first. Nobody ever succeeded. Not once. 10 years. 23 assassination attempts. 4 wars. Countless battles. And every single time, Lyra stood between danger and the king. Which was why nobody noticed the real danger. The feelings. The feelings neither of them admitted. Not even to themselves. Especially not to themselves. The morning began like every other. Darius sat through another council meeting. Nobles argued. Merchants complained. Advisors debated trade routes. The Alpha King looked bored. Very bored. Lyra stood behind him, arms crossed, watching everything. Watching everyone. As always. Then Darius glanced over his shoulder. Their eyes met. Only for a second. Yet somehow, it lasted longer. Much longer. Then one of the advisors cleared his throat, and reality returned. The meeting continued. Unfortunately, someone else had noticed. Prince Cassiel Stormclaw, Darius's younger brother. Cassiel sat silently at the far end of the chamber, watching, observing, thinking, and what he saw worried him greatly. That evening, the kingdom gathered for the Moon Festival, the largest celebration of the year. Thousands filled the capital. Music echoed through every street. Bonfires illuminated the night. Children laughed. Merchants shouted. The atmosphere felt magical, safe, happy, which was exactly why the assassin chose that night. Nobody saw him approach. Not the guards. Not the nobles. Not the Alpha. Only Lyra. Because Lyra always saw everything. The assassin emerged from the crowd, a silver blade hidden beneath his cloak, a deadly weapon designed specifically for werewolves. He moved fast, very fast, toward Darius. The crowd screamed, too late. The blade descended, and Lyra stepped in front of it. Instinct, pure instinct. The weapon struck her side. Pain exploded through her body. Darius's roar shook the festival. The Alpha transformed instantly. Chaos erupted. Guards charged. Citizens fled. The assassin died before taking another breath. But none of that mattered. Because Lyra had fallen, and blood covered her hands. Darius dropped beside her. Fear filled his eyes. Real fear. Not fear for himself. For her. Lyra. The name sounded broken. Almost desperate. The bodyguard tried to smile. I'm fine. She wasn't. Darius knew it. She knew it. Everyone knew it. Then something impossible happened. Blood from Darius's hand touched hers. The world seemed to stop. Moonlight descended from the sky. Silver energy exploded around them. The crowd froze. The guards froze. The entire kingdom froze, because every werewolf alive recognized what they were seeing. The mating bond. A bond blessed by the moon goddess herself. A bond that could never be faked, never be broken, never be denied. The silver light wrapped around Darius. Then Lyra. Then both of them. Their eyes widened simultaneously, because suddenly, they could feel each other. Every emotion, every heartbeat, every fear, every hidden feeling. And there were many, far too many. For 10 years they had buried them, ignored them, pretended they didn't exist. Now there was nowhere left to hide. The bond had revealed everything. Darius stared at Lyra, not as his bodyguard, not as his friend, not as his closest companion, as his mate. And the terrifying truth finally became clear. He had been in love with her for years. Years. Long before the bond, long before the moon goddess, long before destiny. The realization struck hard, because it meant something else. He never wanted anyone else. Not a Luna candidate, not a noblewoman, not a princess. Only Lyra. Always Lyra. Across the festival grounds, whispers spread rapidly. Shock, disbelief, concern. Because the Alpha's mate wasn't royalty, wasn't noble, wasn't politically useful. She was a bodyguard, and the kingdom would never accept it. Unfortunately, the kingdom's opinion wasn't the only problem. Because standing at the edge of the crowd, Prince Cassiel looked horrified. Not angry, not jealous, terrified. As if the bond itself had confirmed his worst fear. A fear he had carried for years. A prophecy nobody else knew about. A prophecy that began with a single sentence, if the Alpha King takes the Wolf Guardian as his mate, and ended with war. Cassiel's hands clenched, because for the first time, the prophecy had begun, and nothing would ever be the same again. The kingdom reacted exactly as Lyra expected. Badly. Very badly. 3 days after the mating bond appeared, the capital was still talking about nothing else, not the harvest, not trade agreements, not border security. Only Lyra, the bodyguard, the woman destined to become Luna, and according to half the nobles, the woman completely unworthy of it. Lyra sat alone in the training yard before sunrise, the only place where she could think clearly. Steel clashed against steel as she practiced. Again, and again, and again, every strike carried frustration. Every movement carried fear. Not fear for herself, fear for Darius. The bond changed everything. And she hated it. Not because she regretted it, because she didn't. That was the problem. For years she had hidden her feelings behind duty, behind discipline, behind loyalty. Now the bond had ripped those walls apart. And suddenly, every glance hurt, every smile hurt, every heartbeat hurt. Because now she knew. Darius felt it too. You're trying to kill the training dummy. Lyra froze. She recognized the voice instantly. Darius. Of course. It was always Darius. She turned. The Alpha King stood leaning against the fence, arms crossed, silver eyes watching her. No crown, no armor, no guards, just Darius. The man she'd spent 10 years trying not to love. Go away. The Alpha smiled. No. Lyra sighed. Your Majesty, don't. The smile disappeared. Don't call me that. His voice softened. Not when we're alone. Silence settled between them. The dangerous kind. The kind neither of them knew how to survive. Finally, Darius stepped closer. One step, then another, until only a few feet separated them. Why are you avoiding me? Lyra looked away. Because the answer was obvious. Because she couldn't look directly at him anymore. Not after the bond. Not after discovering everything she'd buried for years. I'm not avoiding you. Darius raised an eyebrow. You climbed out a window yesterday. Lyra winced. That was fair. And this morning? The Alpha pointed toward the horizon. You started training before sunrise. Another good point. Then Darius took a breath and said the words she'd feared most. Lyra. His voice was quiet. Dangerously quiet. Look at me. She didn't want to, but she did, and immediately regretted it, because she saw it. The truth, the thing he'd hidden just as carefully as she had. Love. 10 years worth of it. Raw, unfiltered, impossible to ignore. For a moment neither moved. Then Darius smiled sadly. I thought I was losing my mind. Lyra frowned. What? The Alpha laughed softly. For years. His silver eyes never left hers. For years I kept wondering why every room felt empty when you weren't there. Lyra's breath caught. Why every victory felt incomplete unless you were beside me. Her heart pounded. Why nobody I met ever compared to you. The world suddenly felt very small, very quiet, very dangerous, because she had waited 10 years to hear those words. And now she desperately wished he would stop. Darius! But he continued. I loved you before the bond. Silence. I loved you before the moon goddess. Another pause. I think I've loved you since the day you saved me. Lyra felt tears burn behind her eyes, because she had loved him just as long, maybe longer, and that was exactly why she stepped backward. One step, then another, away from him. Away from happiness. Away from the things she wanted most, because she remembered something he didn't. The prophecy, or at least, the rumors. The whispers she'd heard years ago, whispers she'd never taken seriously, until now, until Cassiel arrived. The prince stood at the edge of the training yard, looking exhausted, broken, afraid, and somehow, that frightened Lyra more than anything. Because Cassiel never looked afraid, never. Darius, the prince's voice was barely audible. We need to talk. The Alpha immediately noticed the tension, the fear, the urgency. Within minutes, all three stood inside a private chamber, the doors locked, the windows sealed, the guards dismissed. Only then did Cassiel speak. There was a prophecy. Silence. Darius frowned. What prophecy? Cassiel closed his eyes, as though he hated every word he was about to say. The oracle visited our father 16 years ago. The room became still. Very still. Cassiel swallowed, then continued. The prophecy said, if the Alpha King ever mated with the Wolf Guardian, his voice cracked. A war unlike anything we've ever seen would follow. Neither Darius nor Lyra spoke, because suddenly dozens of things made sense. Cassiel's fear, his behavior, his concern, everything. The prince looked directly at Lyra. You weren't supposed to know. Then at Darius. Neither were you. The Alpha stared, disbelief visible across his face. You've known this for years? Cassiel nodded. Since I was 14. The silence became unbearable. Finally, Darius asked, and what exactly did the prophecy say would cause the war? Cassiel looked away. I don't know. That answer surprised everyone, because it sounded honest, painfully honest. The prophecy never explained why. Another pause. Only that your bond would be the beginning. For several seconds, nobody spoke. Then Lyra quietly stood. And everyone knew, immediately. Darius knew, Cassiel knew, Lyra knew. The decision had already been made. No. Darius moved first. Fast. Too fast. He stepped directly in front of her. No. His voice shook. You are not leaving. Lyra couldn't look at him, because if she did, she might stay. And staying was no longer an option. If there's even a chance the prophecy is real. I don't care. The Alpha's response came instantly. And that hurt even more, because she knew he meant it. Darius. I don't care. His voice broke. I'd rather face a war with you than spend another day without you. The room fell silent. Even Cassiel looked away, because some moments were too personal to witness. Tears finally escaped Lyra's eyes. The first she'd allowed herself in years. You are a king. Her voice trembled. The kingdom comes first. Darius shook his head. No. The answer shocked her. No. He stepped closer. You come first. That was the moment Lyra almost stayed. Almost. But almost wasn't enough. That night she packed alone. No ceremony. No goodbye. No explanation. Just silence. Because she knew herself. If she saw Darius one more time, she wouldn't leave. And she had to leave. For him. For the kingdom. For everyone. The letter took nearly an hour to write, and only 10 seconds to leave behind. Then, before sunrise, Lyra Vale disappeared, far away. The first enemy banners appeared on the northern border. Thousands of soldiers, an army no one expected, an army no one was prepared for, and as war drums echoed across the horizon, one terrifying realization spread through the kingdom. The prophecy had begun, but nobody knew whether Lyra had left in time. If loving someone could destroy everything they cared about, would you stay, or would you walk away and break your own heart to save them? Tell me below, and don't forget to subscribe because in the next lines, Darius believes Lyra abandoned him. War engulfs the kingdom. The true meaning of the prophecy is finally revealed, and one choice changes the fate of everyone, because sometimes, the person who leaves you is the person trying hardest to protect you. The kingdom survived, barely, but Darius didn't. Not really. The Alpha King still sat on the throne, still led councils, still commanded armies, still made decisions. Yet something essential was gone. The people saw it. The guards saw it. Even the servants noticed. The laughter disappeared. And that terrified them, because Darius Stormclaw had always laughed. Not because life was easy, Because he refused to let life defeat him. Now, the laughter was gone. Along with Lyra, the letter she left behind remained inside his chambers. He had read it hundreds of times, perhaps thousands. Every word burned. If I stay, I risk your kingdom. If I leave, I only break my own heart. Forgive me. That final sentence hurt most, because he couldn't forgive her, not because he hated her, because he loved her. Too much. Far beyond reason, far beyond pride, far beyond what a king should allow. And every day she remained gone. The pain grew. Unfortunately, the kingdom had bigger problems. The war. The prophecy had begun exactly as Cassiel predicted. Enemy kingdoms united. Ancient rivals formed alliances. Mercenary armies crossed borders. The northern territories fell first. Then the eastern trade routes. Then entire villages disappeared. Stormclaw Kingdom was losing. Badly. One evening Cassiel entered the war chamber. His face looked pale, exhausted, broken, because he finally understood. He had spent years fearing the prophecy, trying to prevent it, only to discover something horrifying. The prophecy wasn't happening because Lyra stayed, it was happening because she left. And suddenly, everything made sense. The prophecy had never warned against their love, it warned against separating them. The realization hit like lightning. Cassiel immediately rode to the capital, straight to Darius. The Alpha listened silently, expressionless, until Cassiel finished. Then silence filled the room. A terrible silence, because Darius understood instantly. Years of fear, years of preparation, years of sacrifice. All built upon a misunderstanding, and now people were dying because of it. The king stood, slowly, dangerously. For one brief second, Cassiel thought Darius might strike him. Instead, the Alpha embraced him. The younger prince froze, completely shocked. I know you were trying to protect us. Cassiel closed his eyes, because somehow, that forgiveness hurt more than anger. Far away, beyond the mountains, beyond the borders, beyond the war, Lyra stood alone, watching smoke rise from distant villages, watching kingdoms burn, watching the world fall apart. And with every passing day, the guilt became unbearable. She had left to stop a war. Instead, the war arrived anyway. Worse than anyone imagined. A messenger finally found her. The young wolf carried a letter. Only one sentence, written in Darius's handwriting. Come home. That was all. Nothing more. No accusations, no demands, no anger. Just 2 words. Come home. Lyra stared at the letter for hours, then finally cried, because home had never been a place. It had always been him. 3 weeks later, the final battle began. The largest army in Stormclaw history assembled outside the capital. Thousands of wolves, thousands of soldiers, thousands prepared to die. The enemy stretched across the horizon, an ocean of steel, an ocean of death, and at the center stood the enemy commander, a warlord known as Varkor the Bloodfang, the true architect behind the war, the man who had secretly manipulated rival kingdoms for years, the man who discovered the prophecy and used it. Because chaos was profitable, fear was profitable, war was profitable. Darius stood before his army, armor covered in silver wolf markings, sword in hand, prepared for the possibility that this might be his last sunrise. Then something happened. A familiar wolf emerged from the forest, running, fast, toward the battlefield, toward him, toward home. The soldiers noticed first, then the guards, then Darius. His heart stopped, because he knew that wolf. He would recognize her anywhere. Lyra. The transformation happened mid-run. One moment a wolf, the next, a woman, breathless, exhausted, beautiful, standing before him. For several seconds neither moved. The battlefield disappeared. The armies disappeared. Everything disappeared. Only Lyra remained. You came back. Darius's voice barely worked. Lyra smiled through tears. You asked me to. The Alpha laughed. For the first time in months. Actually laughed, and every soldier nearby smiled, because they hadn't heard that sound in a very long time. Then Lyra stepped closer. I was wrong. Darius stared. The prophecy. She swallowed. The war wasn't caused by us. Another step. It was caused by fear. Closer. By people trying to separate us. closer. And I'm done running. Silence. Beautiful silence. Then Darius touched her face. Gently. Carefully. As if she might disappear again. You are never leaving me again. Lyra laughed softly. That's not very romantic. It wasn't meant to be. For the first time, she kissed him. Not because of the bond. Not because of destiny. Not because of the moon goddess. Because she chose him. And he chose her. The battle began moments later. But everything felt different now. Because for the first time, neither fought alone. The war lasted until sunset. Varkor fell. The enemy surrendered. The kingdom survived. Peace finally returned. Months later, the capital celebrated. Music filled the streets. Children played. Markets thrived. And inside the palace, a ceremony took place. Not a royal coronation. Not a political alliance. A mating ceremony. The one they never truly had. This time there were no assassins. No prophecies. No fear. Only family. Only friends. Only love. As the moon goddess's light filled the courtyard, Darius looked at Lyra, his bodyguard, his best friend, his greatest strength, his mate, the woman who spent 10 years protecting him, and the woman he would spend the rest of his life protecting. Lyra Vale, his voice carried across the courtyard. I loved you before the bond. Tears filled her eyes. I loved you before destiny. More tears. I loved you before I knew what love was. The entire kingdom fell silent. Then Lyra smiled, the same smile he had carried in his heart for 10 years, and whispered, Good. A pause. Because I loved you first. The crowd erupted, laughter, cheers, tears, and beneath a sky full of moonlight, the Alpha finally married the woman who had always owned his heart. Final question. If you were Lyra, would you have left to protect the person you loved, or would you have stayed and fought beside them from the beginning? Tell me in the comments below. And if this story touched your heart, don't forget to like, subscribe, share, because the next werewolf romance might be even more unforgettable.